In November 2025, Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism announced discoveries that have fundamentally altered understanding of humanity's earliest civilizations. The findings emerge not from a single site, but from a network of interconnected settlements spanning more than 200 kilometers of southeastern Anatolia, each containing monuments that conventional archaeology had deemed impossible for their era. For nearly 3 decades following its excavation beginning in 1995, Göbekli Tepe stood as an isolated anomaly, a single extraordinary site that defied explanation. Massive T-shaped pillars carved with intricate animal reliefs, some weighing between 8 and 16 tons, erected by people whom conventional archaeology classified as nomadic hunter-gatherers who possessed no metal tools, no wheel, no writing system, and no organised agriculture. The site predates Stonehenge by approximately 6,500 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the emergence of pottery anywhere in the world. The conventional response to Göbekli Tepe followed a familiar pattern. Acknowledge the anomaly, classify it as ceremonial or religious, and treat it as an exception that proves the rule. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who excavated the site from 1995 until his death in 2014, proposed that bands of nomads periodically gathered at this hilltop location to construct monumental stone circles, feast on wild game, brew beer from wild grains, and then deliberately bury their constructions under tons of soil and rubble. The site, in this interpretation, represented a one-time explosion of religious enthusiasm, a unique expression of early spirituality that had no precedent and left no successors. This interpretation can no longer be sustained. The 25 excavation season, conducted under the Taş Tepeler project coordinated by Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, has revealed that Göbekli Tepe was not alone. It was not even unusual. It was one node in an extensive regional network of interconnected Neolithic settlements, extending across more than 200 kilometers of the Şanlıurfa highlands. This network includes at least 12 major sites now under active excavation: Göbekli Tepe, Karahantepe, Sayburç, Sefertepe, Çakmaktepe, Habitation, Gürcütepe, Kurttepe, Taştepeler, Ayağanlar, Yoğunburç, and Yenimahalle. Each site contains T-shaped pillars. Each site contains elaborate animal carvings. Each site demonstrates the same sophisticated understanding of stone quarrying, transport, and architectural integration. And each site dates to the same impossible period, approximately 9600 to 8000 BCE. The implications extend far beyond chronological revision. These sites were not isolated ceremonial centres visited by wandering bands. Recent excavations have uncovered domestic structures, grinding tools, storage facilities, water management systems, and evidence of extended occupation spanning centuries. The people who built these monuments were not nomads. They lived in permanent or semi-permanent settlements. They processed wild cereals on an industrial scale. They organised labour forces capable of quarrying, transporting and erecting multi-ton limestone pillars. They developed shared symbolic systems that persisted across hundreds of kilometres and more than 1,000 years. And perhaps most disturbing to the conventional archaeological models, they achieved all of this before the invention of agriculture. The archaeological site identified in a 1963 survey by researchers from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago was initially dismissed as unremarkable. The surveyors noted the presence of limestone slabs scattered across a low mound near the village of Örençik, approximately 15 kilometres northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa. They classified these slabs as grave markers from an Islamic cemetery and moved on. For 3 decades, the site remained undisturbed. Local farmers continued to plough the surrounding fields. The Yildiz family, who owned the land containing the mound, occasionally reported finding unusual stone fragments to the local museum, but no systematic investigation followed. In October 1994, Klaus Schmidt arrived in southeastern Turkey searching for sites similar to Nevaluchori, a pre-pottery Neolithic settlement where he had previously worked. Nevaluchori had produced T-shaped pillars and evidence of early monumental architecture before the site was submerged beneath a reservoir created by the Ataturk Dam in 1992. Schmidt suspected that similar sites might exist in the surrounding region. When he asked villagers about hills containing unusual flint deposits, Mahmut Yildiz guided him to the family's land. Schmidt immediately recognised that the limestone slabs were not grave markers. Their shape, their size, and their surface treatment matched the T-shaped pillars he had documented at Nevelachori. He began excavations the following year. What emerged from beneath the topsoil exceeded any reasonable expectation. The first season revealed not one but several massive T-shaped pillar layers, some standing over 5 meters tall, arranged in circular configurations around even larger central pairs. The pillars were not rough-hewn blocks, but carefully shaped monoliths, their surfaces carved with elaborate bas-reliefs depicting animals, foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, lions, aurochs, and creatures that defied easy identification. The largest pillars featured carved arms along their narrower sides, hands meeting at what would be the abdomen, suggesting that the T-shape represented a stylized human or supernatural figure. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the lowest excavation levels produced dates clustering around 900 to 9000 BCE, placing the earliest construction at Göbekli Tepe firmly within the pre-pottery Neolithic period. This was not merely old, this was the very beginning of the Neolithic era, the earliest phase of that great transition from mobile hunting and gathering to settled agricultural life. According to conventional models, people living during this period should have possessed neither the social organization nor the technical capability to construct monumental architecture. The enclosures Schmidt uncovered followed a consistent pattern. Each consisted of a roughly circular arrangement of T-shaped pillars, with diameters reaching up to 30 meters in the largest examples, with walls of smaller stones connecting the pillars. At the center of each circle stood a pair of larger central pillars, facing each other across an open space. The floors were made of terrazzo, a mixture of burnt lime and aggregate that had to be carefully prepared and applied. Some floors were simply the exposed bedrock carved and smoothed to create level surfaces. Pedestals cut into the bedrock supported the massive central pillars. The pillars themselves represented an extraordinary technical achievement. Analysis of the limestone quarries on the nearby plateau revealed the method of extraction. Neolithic workers identified natural fault lines in the bedrock, then used flint picks and possibly wooden tools to carve channels around the desired pillar shape. When the channels reached sufficient depth, wooden beams and wedges were inserted to lever the finished pillar from its matrix. A partially completed pillar still lying in the western quarry measures 7 meters in length and 1.5 meters in thickness. It was apparently abandoned when a flaw developed in the stone during extraction. Experimental archaeology conducted by the German Archaeological Institute has estimated that approximately 30 untrained workers using basalt hammers could quarry a 7-meter T-shaped pillar in 9 to 10 months. Fire setting combined with water cooling significantly accelerated the process. Transport from quarry to construction site, a distance of several hundred meters over uneven terrain, would have required coordinated teams using ropes, possibly wooden rollers or sledges, and some form of lubrication. Schmidt initially estimated that hundreds of people must have been involved in the construction of each enclosure. More recent labour calculations have significantly revised these estimates. Experiments conducted at Göbekli Tepe itself suggest that all the exposed pre-pottery Neolithic B structures could have been built by 12 to 24 people in less than 4 months, allowing time for quarrying, transport and food preparation. This labour estimate falls within the capability of a single extended family or village community, rather than requiring the mobilisation of multiple groups from across the region. The question of how the pillars were erected once transported to the construction site remains partially unresolved. The central pillars of Enclosure D, the largest complete enclosure documented to date, measure 5.5 meters in height and weigh between 8 and 10 metric tons each. Raising such pillars to vertical position without modern lifting equipment required sophisticated understanding of leverage, counterweights, and coordinated effort. Schmidt cited accounts of megalith construction on the Indonesian island of Nias, where a similar-sized stone required 525 people working for 3 days to erect using traditional methods. Alternative estimates suggest that far fewer people could have accomplished the task using ropes, wooden frames, and water or another lubricant to reduce friction. The absence of metal tools does not imply the absence of mechanical understanding. The builders of Göbekli Tepe clearly possessed extensive practical knowledge of physics, materials, and engineering, even if this knowledge was never formalized in written or mathematical form. For 2 decades following Schmidt's initial discoveries, the scholarly consensus treated Göbekli Tepe as sui generis, a unique phenomenon without parallel in the archaeological record. The site's apparent isolation reinforced interpretations that emphasized its ritual or ceremonial character. Schmidt himself believed that no one had ever lived at Göbekli Tepe. He saw no evidence of habitation, no cooking hearths, no refuse pits, no domestic structures. The site was, in his interpretation, a pilgrimage destination where hunter-gatherer bands periodically gathered for religious purposes before returning to their mobile lifestyles. This interpretation has been fundamentally challenged by excavations conducted since Schmidt's death in 2014 under the direction of Lee Clare of the German Archaeological Institute in collaboration with the Şanlıurfa Museum and Istanbul University. Beginning around 2019, deeper excavations in previously unexplored areas of the tell revealed evidence that had been missed or overlooked in earlier seasons. Rectangular structures interpreted as domestic buildings have been identified through geophysical surveys and targeted excavation. These are not monumental enclosures, but smaller constructions with stone foundations, suggesting permanent habitation rather than temporary ritual visits. Alongside these domestic structures, archaeologists have documented cisterns carved into bedrock, channels designed to collect and direct rainwater, and storage facilities capable of holding substantial quantities of processed grain. The water management system alone represents a significant revision of earlier interpretations. The cisterns documented beneath the site could hold at least 150 cubic meters of water, sufficient to sustain a resident population through dry seasons. The channels directing rainwater into these cisterns demonstrate planning and coordination that presupposes extended occupation rather than periodic visitation. Perhaps most significant is the evidence for cereal processing on an industrial scale. Analysis of grinding stones, mortars and pestles from the site has identified substantial quantities of phytoliths from wheat and barley. The morphology of these plant remains indicates wild rather than domesticated varieties, confirming that the site predates the advent of agriculture in the region. However, the volume of processing equipment suggests something beyond simple subsistence foraging. Archaeologist Dietrich and colleagues have proposed that the inhabitants of Göbekli Tepe engaged in intensive harvesting and processing of wild cereals, possibly including early cultivation experiments that did not yet produce genetically domesticated strains. The processing equipment may also have been used to produce beer from fermented wild grains, a hypothesis supported by the discovery of large stone troughs that could have served as brewing vessels. Schmidt himself had suggested that beer brewing might have played a role in the feasting activities that accompanied construction and ritual use of the monumental enclosures. The archaeofaunal evidence reinforces the picture of intensive exploitation of wild resources. Animal bones recovered from the site come predominantly from wild species. Gazelle accounts for over 60% of identified remains, followed by wild boar, aurochs, sheep, deer, and various bird species including vultures, cranes, ducks, and geese. All bones exhibit cut marks and splintering consistent with butchering and cooking. Large-scale hunting of gazelle appears to have occurred between midsummer and autumn, suggesting seasonal aggregation of human populations to exploit migratory game. This pattern of intensive wild resource exploitation, combined with evidence of permanent or semi-permanent habitation, positions Göbekli Tepe not as an isolated ceremonial centre, but as an early experiment in settled life that preceded full agricultural transformation. The site's inhabitants had developed many of the social, technical and organisational capabilities associated with later Neolithic communities without yet adopting the full suite of agricultural practices that would eventually define the era. The transformation of Göbekli Tepe from anomaly to prototype began with the recognition that similar sites existed throughout the surrounding region. The Taş Tepeler, or stone hills, comprise a cultural landscape extending across the limestone uplands between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, encompassing more than a dozen pre-pottery Neolithic settlements that share distinctive architectural and symbolic features. The most extensively excavated of these sister sites is Karahan Tepe, located approximately 46 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe near the village of Yamerlu. The site was first identified in 1997 by Bahattin Çelik of Harran University during regional surveys, but systematic excavation did not begin until 2019. What has emerged in the intervening years has proven at least as significant as the original discoveries at Göbekli Tepe. Karahantepe may occupy a larger area than its better-known neighbour, and could represent an earlier phase of development. Some dating evidence suggests that the site may have been first occupied around 10,000 to 9500 BCE, potentially predating the earliest construction at Göbekli Tepe by several centuries, though this remains a subject of ongoing research. The settlement continued in use for approximately 1,400 years, spanning three distinct architectural phases that document a remarkable evolution in building practices. The earliest phase consists of circular or oval structures partially carved into the bedrock, with walls of undressed stone and T-shaped pillars set into the perimeter. The second phase introduces rectangular buildings with rounded corners, representing a transitional form between circular and fully rectangular architecture. The final phase features true rectangular structures with sharp corners, suggesting a fundamental shift in spatial organization and construction technique. This architectural sequence mirrors patterns documented at other Neolithic sites across the broader region, from the Levant to central Anatolia. The transition from circular to rectangular building plans has long been recognized as one of the hallmarks of the Neolithic transformation, associated with changes in household organization, property concepts, and social structure. At Karahantepe, this transition occurs within a single continuously occupied settlement, providing an unprecedented window into the mechanics of cultural evolution. The 2025 excavation season at Karahantepe produced discoveries that have captured global attention. The most significant is a circular structure measuring nearly 17 meters in diameter, carved directly into the limestone bedrock. Professor Necmi Kayarol of Istanbul University, director of the Taş Tepeler excavations, has described this structure as resembling an amphitheatre with three tiers of wide stone benches curving around a central focal point. The architectural parallels with classical amphitheatres and odeons are striking, though separated by more than 10,000 years. The tiered seating arrangement suggests that groups of people may have gathered within this space to observe something occurring at the centre, whether a performance, a ritual, a speaker, or some other focus of collective attention. Based on the scale of the structure, it appears capable of accommodating dozens of observers simultaneously, which could imply a level of communal organisation that challenges previous assumptions about pre-pottery Neolithic societies. The central focal point of this amphitheatre-like structure originally contained a prominent sculpture, now partially fallen. The surrounding walls preserve carved human heads set directly into the stone, their features emerging from the bedrock as if the structure itself were coming to life. Seated human statues occupy positions around the floor level, their postures suggesting formal arrangement rather than random placement. These iconographic features represent a dramatic departure from the animal-dominated symbolism of Göbekli Tepe. While both sites employ T-shaped pillars and share many decorative motifs, Karahan Tepe demonstrates a marked increase in human representation, including some of the most realistic depictions of the human form known from the Neolithic period. The most remarkable example is a 2.3-metre tall statue discovered in September 23, depicting a seated male figure with anatomically detailed features. The figure's face preserves recognisable eyes, nose, and possibly a beard. The torso displays carved ribs, sternum, and shoulder bones, creating an almost skeletal appearance. Most striking is the explicit depiction of the figure holding his erect phallus with both hands, a motif that has drawn comparisons to fertility symbolism. Documented in cultures spanning millennia and continents, this statue was found seated within a niche fixed to the ground, suggesting permanent installation rather than portable use. In the same area, excavators recovered a vulture sculpture with detailed beak, eyes, and wings, along with stone plates arranged on the ground in what appears to be deliberate configuration. The combination of death imagery, possibly symbolised by the skeletal torso and the vulture, with fertility imagery embodied in the explicit phallic representation, could suggest a complex cosmological system that integrated life and death within a unified symbolic framework. Though definitive interpretation remains elusive without written records from the period. The amphitheatre-like structure at Karahantepe is not the only monumental construction revealed by recent excavations. Higher on the site, archaeologists have uncovered a rectangular communal building with dimensions approximately 9 by 7 metres and preserved wall heights, suggesting a substantial original structure. Stone benches carved into the rock line the interior walls, and 4 T-shaped pillars occupy symmetrical positions within the space. Most significant is the preservation of plaster on interior surfaces, indicating that the original structure was finished and maintained with applied coatings rather than left as exposed stone. The survival of plaster implies protection from weathering, which in turn suggests that the building was roofed. Roofing a structure of these dimensions using only stone, wood and organic materials represents a significant engineering challenge, requiring understanding of load distribution, span limitations, and structural reinforcement. On the north wall of this rectangular building, a stone bowl is set into the masonry, with a carved channel extending from it to direct liquid flow. Professor Carroll has suggested that this feature served some ritual purpose, with the liquid, whether water, wine, blood, or some other substance, forming part of ceremonies conducted within the space. The integration of specialized architectural features into the building's fabric indicates that function and design were coordinated from the initial planning phase rather than added as afterthoughts. The density of construction at Karahantepe has led some researchers to propose that the site may represent one of the earliest known villages, with closely clustered buildings sharing party walls and minimal ground-level access routes. This settlement pattern, which would reappear millennia later at sites like Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, has led to speculation that movement between structures may have occurred across rooftops rather than through alleyways at ground level. If accurate, such an arrangement would have implications for social organisation, defensive considerations, and daily patterns of interaction among residents. The fun 400-year occupation span documented at Karahantepe provides an unusual opportunity to examine cultural evolution within a single continuously inhabited settlement. The progression from circular to rectangular architecture, the shift from animal-dominated to human-centered iconography, the development of specialized ritual spaces, and the elaboration of water management and storage facilities all occur within the stratigraphic sequence of this one site. What emerges is not a static culture frozen at a single moment, but a dynamic society undergoing continuous transformation over dozens of generations. Beyond Göbekli Tepe and Karahantepe, the Taş Tepeler network includes numerous additional sites that are only beginning to yield their secrets. Sayburç, located approximately 20 kilometers southwest of Şanlıurfa, has emerged as a particularly significant settlement following excavations that began in 2021 under the direction of Associate Professor Ilham Özdoğan of Istanbul University. The 2025 season at Sayburç revealed more than 50 Neolithic structures dating back approximately 1200 years, making the site contemporaneous with or slightly earlier than Göbekli Tepe. Like its neighbours, Sayburç features T-shaped pillars integrated into both domestic and communal architecture. However, the site has produced some of the most elaborate narrative reliefs yet documented from the pre-pottery Neolithic period. A limestone bench discovered in 2021 bears a carved scene depicting human figures interacting with animals in what appears to be a continuous narrative sequence. One panel shows a figure holding their phallus in the right hand, a motif that echoes the Karahantepe statue. Another section depicts a figure controlling an aurochs, grasping what appears to be a contraption or lead rope while the massive wild bovine stands alongside. The scene has been interpreted as representing either hunting, taming, or ritual interaction between humans and animals, offering rare direct evidence for the conceptual relationship between Neolithic peoples and the creatures that dominated their symbolic world. The 2025 discoveries at Sayburç include a striking human sculpture with what researchers describe as a stitched mouth, the lips appearing sealed or bound shut. Eye sockets that may originally have held shell inlays give the figure an unsettling corpse-like appearance. Professor Carroll and his colleagues have proposed that this figure may represent a deceased individual, possibly an ancestor whose silent presence was invoked through the sculpture. The sealed mouth could symbolize the silence of death, the inability of the dead to speak, or perhaps a ritual restriction on speech associated with funerary practices, though without written records. Such interpretations remain provisional. This interpretation gains support from broader patterns of death-related imagery across the Taş Tepeler sites. The vulture carvings at Göbekli Tepe, particularly the elaborate relief on Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, have long been interpreted as depicting excarnation, the practice of exposing corpses to carrion birds as part of funerary ritual. Similar practices are documented at later Neolithic sites in the region, including Çatalhöyük, where vulture imagery and skull removal formed part of elaborate death cults. The Sayburç sculpture with its sealed mouth suggests that concepts of death, silence, and ancestral presence were central to the symbolic systems of these early communities. Sefertepe, another Taş Tepeler site under active excavation, has produced discoveries that complicate the picture of regional stylistic unity. Two carved human faces revealed in the 2025 season, one executed in high relief and the other in low relief display. Proportions, surface treatment, and overall expression that differ markedly from representations at Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and Sayburç. The subtle variations in cheek curvature, brow structure, and the treatment of the nose suggest that Sefertepe communities developed their own local artistic idiom within the broader Taş Tepeler cultural sphere. This pattern of shared tradition combined with local variation appears throughout the network. The T-shaped pillar form is universal, as are certain animal motifs and the general organisation of communal structures around central pillar pairs. Yet each site exhibits distinctive elements that suggest some degree of artistic autonomy and local identity. The Taş Tepeler were not a homogeneous culture, but a network of related communities, each participating in shared traditions while maintaining aspects of independent cultural expression. A particularly intriguing find from Sefertepe is a double-sided bead carved from black serpentinite, depicting two human faces emerging from opposite sides of the stone. The tiny object, polished to a soft sheen and pierced for suspension, demonstrates that complex symbolic meanings were not reserved for monumental architectures, but extended to small portable objects that could be worn on the body or exchanged between individuals. The double-face motif invites interpretations related to duality, transformation, or protective symbolism, though its precise meaning remains unknown, suggesting conceptual sophistication that matches the architectural achievements. The question of labour organisation at Taş Tepeler sites has been central to debates about Neolithic social complexity since Göbekli Tepe's discovery. The initial estimates that hundreds or thousands of workers must have participated in construction activities implied social structures capable of mobilising and coordinating large populations, contradicting models that viewed pre-pottery Neolithic societies as composed of small egalitarian bands with limited organisational capacity. Recent experimental archaeology and comparative analysis have substantially revised these labour estimates. The structures exposed at Göbekli Tepe could plausibly have been built by groups of 12 to 24 people, a number consistent with extended family or small village populations. This does not diminish the achievement, but recontextualizes it. The construction of monumental architecture did not require exceptional mobilization of labour beyond normal community capacity. What it required was sustained commitment over extended periods, technical knowledge accumulated across generations, and social systems that transmitted and coordinated this knowledge. The engineering challenges involved in Taş Tepeler construction remain impressive regardless of labour force size. Quarrying multi-ton limestone pillars using only stone tools required understanding of the material properties, fault lines, and extraction techniques. Transporting these pillars over uneven terrain demanded knowledge of leverage, friction reduction, and coordinated effort. Erecting pillars to vertical position involved calculated risk, precise timing, and probably extensive practice with smaller stones before attempting the largest examples. Most challenging of all was the integration of carved decoration with their architectural function. The animal reliefs and anthropomorphic details on T-shaped pillars were not added after construction, but carved before the pillars were erected. This means that sculptors working in the quarries had to anticipate the final position and orientation of each pillar, calculating how their work would appear once the stone was raised and set into place. The coordination between quarry workers, transporters, erectors, and sculptors implies division of labour and specialisation that presupposes organised community structure. The technical sophistication extends to less visible aspects of construction. Terrazzo floors required sourcing and burning limestone to produce calcium oxide, mixing this with aggregate material, and applying the mixture while still workable before it hardened. The process demands knowledge of chemistry, timing, and technique that could only have been acquired through extensive experimentation and transmitted through formal or informal training. Water management systems, including cisterns, channels, and possibly wells, required understanding of hydrology, ground permeability, and seasonal precipitation patterns. The scale of these systems at sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahantepe indicates planning horizons extending beyond immediate needs to anticipate future dry seasons and population growth. The accumulation of these technical capabilities within pre-pottery Neolithic communities suggests inheritance of knowledge from still earlier periods. The Taş Tepeler sites do not, represent the sudden emergence of previously unknown technologies, but the elaboration and monumentalization of techniques with deeper roots. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, dated to approximately 1000 to 950 BCE, may represent precursors to the Taş Tepeler culture, possessing artistic and material traditions that were subsequently amplified at Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites. Perhaps the most counterintuitive finding from the Taş Tepeler excavations concerns the temporal pattern of architectural achievement. Conventional models of cultural evolution assume progressive development, with early examples being simpler and later examples more sophisticated as knowledge accumulates and techniques improve. The Taş Tepeler sequence inverts this expectation. The earliest structures at Göbekli Tepe and Karahantepe are also the most ambitious. The massive circular enclosures with their towering central pillars, elaborate animal reliefs, and sophisticated terrazzo floors belong to the oldest construction phases. Later building periods produce smaller structures, simpler decorations, and reduced pillar sizes. The architectural sequence moves not from primitive to advanced, but from advanced to declining, from monumental achievement to modest reproduction. This pattern has been termed capability loss rather than capability gain, and it poses significant interpretive challenges. Why would communities that possess the knowledge and organization to construct massive stone enclosures gradually abandon these capabilities over subsequent generations? Several hypotheses have been proposed, none entirely satisfactory. One possibility is shifting priorities. The earliest communities may have invested heavily in monumental construction as part of establishing themselves in the landscape, creating sacred places that anchored their territory and identity. Once these monuments existed, later generations had less incentive to replicate them at equivalent scale. Maintenance and modification of existing structures may have replaced new construction as the primary architectural focus. Another hypothesis emphasizes changing social systems. The construction of large monuments may have been associated with specific forms of social organization, perhaps involving competitive feasting, ritual leadership, or inter-community coordination. If these social structures changed over time, perhaps as a result of population growth, resource stress, or ideological transformation, the capacity and motivation for monumental construction may have diminished accordingly. Environmental pressures offer a third explanation. Climate fluctuations at the end of the Pleistocene and beginning of the Holocene produced significant changes in precipitation, vegetation, and animal populations across the Near East. The abundant resources that supported early Taş Tepeler communities may have become less reliable over time, forcing populations to redirect labour from construction to subsistence activities. Finally, knowledge loss itself may explain the declining trajectory. The technical capabilities required for monumental construction were not genetically transmitted, but culturally learned. If the social mechanisms for transmitting specialised knowledge broke down, whether through population decline, social disruption, or simple generational discontinuity, capabilities could be lost within a few generations regardless of their previous sophistication. The Taş Tepeler sequence thus provides a cautionary example of non-linear cultural development. Progress is not guaranteed. Capabilities achieved by one generation may not be maintained by the next. The assumption that history moves inevitably toward greater complexity finds no support in the archaeological record of southeastern Turkey. The relationship between the Taş Tepeler culture and the subsequent emergence of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent has become one of the most actively debated questions in Adaptation, Neolithic archaeology. The conventional model, established through decades of research beginning with V. Gordon Child's concept of the Neolithic Revolution, posited agriculture as the necessary precondition for all subsequent social complexity. Only after people began cultivating plants and herding animals, the argument ran, could they produce the surplus food required to support non-food producing specialists, construct monuments, develop ritual systems, and create the other hallmarks of civilization. Göbekli Tepe and the broader Taş Tepeler network appear to reverse this sequence. Monumental architecture, specialized craft production, complex symbolism, and organized communal activity all appear at these sites before the domestication of plants or animals. The inhabitants of Göbekli Tepe consumed wild wheat and barley, wild gazelle and aurochs. Their descendants in the same region would eventually become the first farmers, domesticating the very species their ancestors had, hunted and foraged. But the monuments came first. Klaus Schmidt encapsulated this reversal in the phrase, "First the temple, then the city, persist that the demands of constructing and maintaining monumental religious centres drove the development of sedentism, surplus production, and eventually agriculture. People did not settle down because they had learned to farm. They learned to farm because they had settled down to participate in religious activities that required sustained presence and reliable food supplies. This hypothesis has been refined and elaborated by subsequent researchers. One influential variant emphasizes the role of feasting in creating demand for agricultural products. The construction of monumental structures like those at Göbekli Tepe apparently involved communal feasting, with large quantities of meat and grain consumed during building phases and ritual occasions. The animal bones recovered from the site attest to large-scale hunting and butchering, while grinding equipment suggests substantial cereal processing, possibly including beer production. If ritual feasting required reliable supplies of grain and meat, then communities had strong incentives to develop methods for ensuring these supplies. Intentional cultivation of wild cereals, initially without genetic domestication, could have increased yields and predictability. Management of wild animal populations, perhaps through selective hunting or early herding, could have ensured meat availability for important occasions. Over generations, these management practices could have intensified into full agriculture. The geographical coincidence supports this interpretation. Göbekli Tepe lies at the heart of the region where both wheat and barley were first domesticated. Genetic studies of modern cultivated wheat have traced its ancestry to wild populations growing within a few dozen kilometres of the site. The Karahan Mountains, visible from Göbekli Tepe's summit, harbour wild wheat varieties that are the closest known relatives of domesticated strains. If agriculture originated anywhere, it originated here, among the descendants of the people who built these monuments. Alternative interpretations challenge the temple before agriculture hypothesis without rejecting its empirical basis. Lee Clare and colleagues from the German Archaeological Institute have proposed that Göbekli Tepe represents not the vanguard of agricultural development, but a conservative rejection of it. In this reading, the site's inhabitants were hunter-gatherers who observed agricultural practices emerging in surrounding communities and deliberately refused to adopt them. The threatening animal imagery carved on the pillars, with bared teeth, powerful claws, and aggressive postures, represented a cultural assertion of hunting identity against the encroaching agricultural lifestyle. This interpretation finds support in the observation that Göbekli Tepe contains no evidence of domesticated plants or animals throughout its occupation, even during periods when domestication had clearly begun elsewhere in the region. The site may have been abandoned around 8000 BCE precisely because the agricultural transformation that its builders had resisted became irresistible, making the hunter-gatherer ideology embodied in the monuments obsolete. Whether the Taş Tepeler communities drove agricultural development or resisted it, their relationship to this transformative process was clearly intimate. They lived at the geographical centre of agricultural origins, during the centuries when domestication first occurred, among the wild ancestors of the world's most important crop plants. Their monuments preserve a record of the final phase of hunter-gatherer existence before agriculture transformed human society irrevocably. The symbolic systems expressed in Taş Tepeler iconography have attracted extensive scholarly attention, though interpretation remains tentative and contested. The T-shaped pillars themselves appear to represent stylized human figures, with the horizontal top section suggesting shoulders or a head and the vertical shaft representing the body. Carved arms on some pillars, hands meeting at the abdomen or grasping objects, reinforce this anthropomorphic interpretation. Belts and loincloths depicted in relief add clothing to otherwise abstract forms. Whether these figures represent humans, ancestors, supernatural beings, or deities cannot be determined with certainty. The absence of written texts from the pre-pottery Neolithic period means that interpretation depends entirely on iconographic analysis and comparison with later documented traditions. Schmidt and others have suggested that the pillars may represent supernatural guardians or protective spirits, their presence within the enclosures creating sacred spaces set apart from ordinary life. Animal imagery dominates the decorative program at Göbekli Tepe and most Taş Tepeler sites. The carved reliefs depict a consistent repertoire of species: snakes, foxes, boars, aurochs, vultures, cranes, scorpions, lions, and various birds. Many animals are shown in aggressive postures, with bared teeth, extended claws, or threatening postures. This emphasis on dangerous animals has led some researchers to interpret the imagery as apotropaic, designed to ward off evil spirits or dangerous forces through the representation of powerful creatures. Professor Nekmi Karol has proposed dividing the animal iconography into two categories. The first includes animals whose threatening nature is emphasized, typically depicted on the T-shaped pillars themselves. The second includes animals that formed part of daily life, including gazelles, birds, and wild donkeys, more often depicted on floor slabs and smaller objects. This distinction suggests that different types of animals serve different symbolic functions, with dangerous predators occupying a different conceptual category from prey species and domesticable animals. The shift from animal-dominated to human-centered symbolism observed at Karahantepe relative to Göbekli Tepe may represent a fundamental transformation in worldview, though the evidence permits multiple interpretations. Based on the iconographic evidence, early Taş Tepeler communities may have conceived of themselves within a world populated by powerful animal forces, with humans occupying a subordinate or embedded position within the natural order. Later communities appear to have placed the human figure at the center of symbolic attention, creating realistic sculptures that emphasized human anatomy, sexuality, and mortality. This shift could reflect changing relationships between humans and their environment, perhaps associated with the transition from hunting to agriculture, though direct causal connections cannot be established from material evidence alone. The integration of death symbolism throughout Taş Tepeler iconography suggests that mortuary concerns occupied a central position in community ideology. Vultures, widely associated with excarnation practices, appear prominently at multiple sites. The skeletal appearance of the Karahan Tepe statue, with its visible ribs and emaciated torso, evokes images of death and decomposition. The sealed-mouth figure from Sayburç explicitly depicts a deceased individual. Skull manipulation, documented at later Neolithic sites in the region, may have had precedence at Taş Tepeler sites, though evidence remains limited. The possibility that the T-shaped pillars themselves represent ancestors or the deceased has been proposed, but not conclusively demonstrated. The anthropomorphic form, combined with the absence of individualized features, could represent generic ancestral figures rather than specific deceased individuals. If the enclosures served as spaces for communing with or honoring ancestors, the pillars may have provided architectural embodiment for these presences. The preservation of the Taş Tepeler sites results partly from deliberate human action in antiquity. At Göbekli Tepe and apparently at Karahantepe, the monumental enclosures were intentionally filled with soil, stone rubble, and settlement debris around 8000 BCE. This backfilling protected the stone structures from weathering and preserved them in remarkably complete condition for subsequent discovery. The reasons for this deliberate burial remain uncertain. Schmidt originally interpreted it as ritual decommissioning, with communities ceremonially closing their sacred spaces before abandoning them. The backfilling would then represent a final act of respect or closure, preserving the monuments in a state of eternal rest rather than allowing them to decay through neglect. Alternative interpretations suggest more practical motivations. Landslides documented in the stratigraphic sequence indicate that the enclosures were repeatedly damaged by natural processes, with soil and debris sliding into the lower-lying structures from surrounding slopes. Retaining walls were constructed to prevent this damage, but the effort required for continuous maintenance may eventually have exceeded community capacity or willingness. Deliberate backfilling may have represented abandonment and practical protection rather than ritual closure. The backfilling also complicates the archaeological interpretation of the sites. Material found within the fill cannot necessarily be associated with the period when the enclosures were in use. Radiocarbon dates from fill deposits have produced ages younger than expected, leading to debates about whether the fill was deposited in a single event or accumulated over extended periods. The current consensus, developed since Schmidt's death, recognizes that the fill represents a complex sequence of deposition rather than a single ritual burial. What the backfilling does confirm is the end of the Taş Tepeler tradition. Around 8000 BCE, monumental construction in this distinctive style ceased throughout the region. The enclosures were closed, the sites abandoned, and the cultural tradition that had produced them terminated. Within a few centuries, the descendants of these communities had fully adopted agriculture, established permanent villages, and begun the journey toward the complex societies that would eventually produce the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world. The Taş Tepeler thus occupy a unique position in human history, the final fluorescence of hunter-gatherer monumental culture, occurring at the very moment when agriculture was transforming human existence irrevocably. The sites preserve a snapshot of a vanished world, a record of capabilities and concepts that would not resurface for millennia, if they reappeared at all. The scale of what remains undiscovered at Taş Tepeler sites is difficult to overstate. As of 2021, less than 10% of Göbekli Tepe had been excavated. Geophysical surveys have identified at least 20 large enclosures beneath the surface of the tell, most of which have never been touched by archaeologists. Dr. Mehmet Ünal of Harran University's Department of Archaeology has suggested that at least 15 additional stone enclosures remain buried, with some researchers speculating that one enclosure might date as far back as 15,000 years ago. Though this extreme antiquity remains highly speculative and unconfirmed by radiocarbon dating. At current excavation rates, complete investigation of Göbekli Tepe alone could require another 150 years. The other Taş Tepeler sites are even less explored, with most having undergone only preliminary survey and limited test excavation. The full extent of the regional network remains unknown, as additional sites continue to be identified through satellite imagery, ground surveys and local reports. The Turkish government has invested substantially in the Taş Tepeler project, recognising both its scientific importance and its potential for cultural tourism. A new visitor centre at Gobekli Tepe opened in 2021, and facilities at Karahantepe are nearing completion. International exhibitions have brought Taş Tepeler artefacts to audiences worldwide, including a major installation at the Colosseum in Rome that drew 6 million visitors between October 2024 and March 25. Future research will benefit from technological advances unavailable to earlier generations of archaeologists. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning, geomagnetic surveys, and other remote sensing techniques allow detailed mapping of subsurface features without excavation. DNA analysis of human and animal remains promises insights into population relationships, migration patterns, and domestication process. Isotope studies can reveal dietary patterns, seasonal movement, and geographic origins of individuals and materials. The interpretive frameworks applied to Taş Tepeler data continue to evolve as new discoveries challenge established models. The simple categories of hunter-gatherer versus agricultural, nomadic versus sedentary, ritual versus domestic prove inadequate for capturing the complexity of these early communities. New conceptual tools are required to understand societies that combined elements from both sides of traditional dichotomies, that built monuments before they built farms, that created sophisticated symbolic systems without writing, and that achieved organizational complexity without hierarchy as conventionally understood. The archaeological record from Göbekli Tepe and the broader Taş Tepeler network establishes several conclusions that resist reasonable dispute. First, monumental architecture appeared in southeastern Turkey by approximately 9600 BCE, among populations that subsisted primarily through hunting and gathering. Second, this architecture was not isolated but distributed across a regional network of interconnected sites sharing distinctive features including T-shaped pillars, animal iconography, and circular or oval enclosure plans. Third, these communities possess technical capabilities in quarrying, transport construction, and artistic production that far exceeded what previous models had attributed to pre-pottery Neolithic societies. Fourth, the sites show evidence of extended occupation, specialized activity areas, and resource management systems consistent with permanent or semi-permanent settlement. Fifth, the tradition persisted for approximately 100 years before terminating, around 8000 BCE, coinciding with the full establishment of agriculture in the region. Beyond these established facts, interpretation remains contested. The function of the monumental enclosures, whether primarily religious, social, political, or multifunctional, cannot be determined from material evidence alone. The relationship between Taş Tepeler communities and the emergence of agriculture involves complex causation that resists simple formulas. The meaning of the elaborate iconographic programs in the absence of contemporary texts depends on inference and analogy with later documented traditions. What the evidence demonstrates decisively is that conventional models of Neolithic development require fundamental revision. The sequence agriculture, surplus complexity, monumentality finds no support in the Taş Tepeler record. The assumptions that hunter-gatherer societies lacked organizational capacity, technical sophistication or symbolic elaboration are contradicted by every excavation season. The belief that progress moves inevitably from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced, cannot accommodate the declining trajectory of Taş Tepeler architecture. These discoveries arrive at a moment when archaeological understanding of the human past is undergoing broader transformation. Sites across the globe have pushed back the dates for various cultural achievements: artistic representation, navigation, symbolic behaviour, long-distance trade. The clean lines that once separated modern from archaic humanity, civilization from barbarism, history from prehistory have blurred beyond recognition. Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites contribute to this dissolution, revealing that complexity, sophistication and achievement emerged far earlier, and in forms far more varied than 19th and 20th century scholars could imagine. The people who built these monuments left no texts to explain their intentions. Their descendants, who inherited the stone agricultural revolution that transformed the world, apparently retain no memory of the achievements their ancestors had buried beneath the Turkish hills. For 12,000 years, the stones lay silent beneath the earth, waiting for archaeologists who would not arrive until the 20th century, working with conceptual tools still being developed in the 21st. The excavations continue. Each season brings new discoveries, new questions, new revisions of what seemed established. The 2025 findings have revealed the Taş Tepeler as a network rather than an anomaly, a cultural phenomenon rather than a unique exception. Future seasons will reveal more: additional sites, additional structures, additional artifacts that challenge or confirm current interpretations. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe resist simple categorization. Too sophisticated for what we thought we knew about their era, too complex for the societies we imagined building them, they stand at the boundary between what archaeology had established and what it must now reconsider. The builders of these monuments achieved what our theories told us they could not achieve. They organized what our models told us they could not organize. They created what our frameworks told us they could not create. Perhaps the difficulty lies not in the ancient stones, but in modern expectations about how ancient peoples understood and shaped their world. The boundaries between categories that seem natural to us, between sacred and secular, between hunter and farmer, between primitive and advanced, may have been more fluid in the minds of Neolithic peoples than our analytical frameworks allow. The Taş Tepeler remain, preserved in their deliberate burial, offering testimony to capabilities and achievements that exceed what we believed possible, challenging not just the timeline of human development, but the very models through which we understand that development. The stones wait, as they have waited for millennia, for scholars willing to engage with their complexity. The craft production documented at Taş Tepeler sites extends far beyond monumental stone carving. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of specialized bead workshops, with production debris indicating systematic manufacture of ornamental objects from various materials including limestone, serpentinite, jade, and bone. The technical skill required for bead production rivals that demonstrated in architectural contexts. A two-faced serpentinite bead discovered at Sefertepe in 2005 exemplifies this craftsmanship. The object measures only a few centimeters in diameter, yet displays carved human features on both sides, with careful attention to facial proportions and expression. A central perforation allows the bead to be strung for wearing, meaning that the carving had to be executed without damaging the structural integrity of this delicate suspension point. The polish on the surface indicates extended finishing work, transforming rough stone into a reflective, smooth object suitable for display against skin or fabric. Frog amulets, zoomorphic pendants, and patterned pieces recovered from multiple sites indicate a rich tradition of personal adornment that accompanied the monumental architecture. These portable objects could be worn, exchanged, gifted, or buried with their owners, creating networks of symbolic significance that extended beyond the fixed monuments into the mobile lives of individuals. The snake and eel motif appearing on carved blocks at several sites may have carried protective or transformative significance, though specific meanings cannot be recovered from material evidence alone. The presence of obsidian at Taş Tepeler sites provides evidence for long-distance exchange networks extending hundreds of kilometers. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its ability to produce extremely sharp cutting edges, does not occur naturally in the limestone highlands around Şanlıurfa, the nearest Obsidian sources lie in central Anatolia and eastern Turkey, requiring transport across substantial distances to reach Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites. The obsidian at Taş Tepeler sites appears in the form of finished tools and production debris, indicating that raw material was imported and processed locally, rather than arriving as finished products. This pattern suggests sustained contact between Taş Tepeler communities and obsidian-producing regions, whether through direct procurement expeditions, intermediary traders, or some combination of exchange mechanisms. The organizational requirements for maintaining such long-distance connections reinforce conclusions about social complexity derived from architectural evidence. The architectural evolution documented across the Taş Tepeler sequence follows patterns that reappear throughout the subsequent history of the Near East. The transition from circular to rectangular building plans, the shift from communal to household-centered organization, the elaboration of storage and water management facilities, and the development of standardized construction techniques all anticipate developments that would characterize Neolithic settlements across the Fertile Crescent and beyond. At Sayburç, excavations have documented this transition with particular clarity. The settlement's 300-year occupation during a crucial transitional period preserves evidence of gradual architectural change within a continuously inhabited community. Early structures follow circular or oval plans with T-shaped pillars integrated into perimeter walls. Later structures adopt rectangular forms with sharper corners, reduced pillar sizes, and increased standardization of room dimensions. The latest phases show fully rectangular buildings that would not be out of place in village sites dating thousands of years later. This architectural transformation has traditionally been interpreted as reflecting changes in household or organization, property concepts, and social structure, though such interpretations remain debated. Some researchers suggest that circular buildings, with their absence of internal divisions and their emphasis on central communal space, may have housed extended family groups practicing relatively egalitarian resource sharing. Rectangular buildings, with their capacity for internal subdivision and their alignment along streets or pathways, may have housed nuclear families asserting increased independence and privacy, though alternative explanations exist. The persistence of T-shaped pillars throughout this transition at Sayburç suggests continuity of symbolic tradition even as practical architecture evolved. Single pillars appear in domestic structures, while communal buildings feature multiple pillars arranged along walls or in central positions. This variation could hint at social hierarchies, with access to pillar symbolism potentially marking distinctions between ordinary households and community leadership or ritual specialists, though such interpretations remain provisional. The density of construction at Sayburç, with more than 50 structures identified in a relatively compact area, indicates substantial resident population. Estimates based on structure counts and average household sizes suggest communities numbering in the hundreds, rather than the small bands typically imagined for pre-pottery Neolithic populations. Such population density would have created pressures for conflict resolution, resource allocation, and collective decision-making that required institutional responses beyond the capabilities of simple kinship-based organization. The evidence for roofing at Taş Tepeler structures has implications that extend beyond simple shelter provision. The preservation of interior plaster at Karahantepe's rectangular communal building implies protection from precipitation, which in turn requires substantial roof construction. Roofing a structure measuring approximately 9 by 7 meters using only locally available materials presents significant engineering challenges. Stone, while abundant in the limestone highlands, is too heavy and brittle for spanning large distances without intermediate support. The T-shaped pillars within the Karahantepe building may have served as roof supports, with their flat tops providing bearing surfaces for wooden beams. However, the span distances involved would have required timber of substantial dimensions, implying access to forest resources that may have been located some distance from the construction sites. Alternative roofing materials include bundles of reeds, layers of brush and mud, or combinations of organic materials that have not survived in the archaeological record. The terrazzo floors at Göbekli Tepe, which show no evidence of extensive weathering or frost damage, suggest that the overlying structures remained intact for extended periods, providing consistent protection from the elements. The possibility of conical or domed roofing has been proposed for the circular enclosures at Gobekli Tepe, with the T-shaped pillars potentially serving as supports for roof structures that rose towards central openings or peaks. If such construction existed, it would have created dramatic interior spaces with light filtering through upper openings to illuminate the carved pillars below. The theatrical potential of such spaces, with their controlled lighting, acoustics and sightlines, may have enhanced their effectiveness as settings for ritual performance or communal gathering, though definitive evidence for roofing remains elusive. The engineering knowledge required for successful roofing, including understanding of load distribution, span limitations, material properties and weather resistance, adds another dimension to the technical sophistication demonstrated by Taş Tepeler builders. This knowledge would have been empirically developed through trial and error, transmitted through apprenticeship and practice, and refined across generations of construction activity. The desert kites documented in the broader Taş Tepeler region provide evidence for organised hunting practices on a scale that approaches animal management. These extensive dry stone wall structures, often several hundred metres in length, were designed to channel migrating game animals, particularly gazelles, into trap enclosures where they could be captured or killed efficiently. Desert kites appear in the archaeological record, across the Near East from the Neolithic period onward, but their association with Taş Tepeler sites suggests particularly early development. The construction of kites required substantial labour investment, coordinated planning and detailed knowledge of animal behaviour and migration routes. Communities that invested in such infrastructure were not simply hunting opportunistically, but managing wild animal populations with long-term perspectives. The presence of desert kites near Taş Tepeler sites correlates with the abundant gazelle bones recovered from excavations. Gazelle accounts for over 60% of identified animal remains at Göbekli Tepe, which could suggest that systematic hunting using kite structures may have provided a significant portion of animal protein consumed at the site. The seasonal patterns of gazelle procurement, concentrated in summer and autumn months based on archaeozoological analysis, align with known migration schedules for wild populations in the region. This pattern of intensive, organised hunting represents an intermediate stage between pure foraging and full animal domestication. Communities that constructed kites maintained them across seasons and coordinated hunting efforts during migration periods, were practicing a form of resource management that shared organisational characteristics with later herding. The step from channeling wild animals into trap enclosures to confining them in permanent corrals was conceptually smaller than the step from opportunistic hunting to kite-based procurement. The symbolic representation of gazelles and other hunted species on Taş Tepeler monuments may reflect awareness of this relationship between human planning and animal availability. Some researchers have proposed that the threatening imagery of predators, with their bared teeth and aggressive postures, could represent human identification with apex predators, asserting dominance over prey species through both physical hunting and symbolic representation, though such interpretations remain speculative. The genetic evidence from Taş Tepeler sites and their immediate successors contributes to understanding of population dynamics during the Neolithic transition. Human samples from Göbekli Tepe dated to approximately 9000 to 8500 BCE, and Sayburç dated to approximately 8300 to 7500 BCE, have been analysed as part of broader studies of Neolithic genetics. These samples cluster with other Mesopotamian Neolithic populations, suggesting regional continuity rather than replacement by incoming groups. The genetic data indicate that the populations who built the Taş Tepeler monuments were ancestral to later Neolithic and eventually Bronze Age communities in the region. There is no evidence for mass migration or population replacement coinciding with the agricultural transition. The same people, or their direct descendants, who constructed Göbekli Tepe as hunter-gatherers became the farmers of subsequent millennia. This continuity has implications for understanding the relationship between cultural transformation and population stability. The dramatic changes documented in subsistence practices, settlement patterns, and material culture across the Neolithic transition were not driven by the arrival of new populations bringing new technologies. They were generated within existing communities through processes of innovation, adaptation, and cultural evolution that transformed societies from within. The genetic evidence also reveals connections between Taş Tepeler populations and communities across the broader Fertile Crescent. Shared ancestry and genetic exchange linked southeastern Turkey with the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Iran, suggesting that the cultural networks documented through shared architectural and symbolic traditions had biological correlates in patterns of movement, intermarriage, and population mixing. the question of social stratification within Taş Tepeler communities remains difficult to address from available evidence. Monumental construction projects have traditionally been associated with hierarchical social organisation, with elites directing labour and extracting surplus from subordinate populations. However, the labour estimates for Taş Tepeler construction suggest that relatively small groups could have accomplished the documented achievements, potentially without requiring coercive hierarchy. Alternative models of social organisation emphasise cooperative rather than coercive dynamics. Communities may have participated voluntarily in construction activities, motivated by religious commitment, social prestige, kinship obligations, or participation in feasting activities. The competitive feasting model proposes that different kin groups or communities competed to host the most elaborate events, with monumental construction serving as both the setting and the means for accumulating social capital. The absence of obvious, high-status burials at Taş Tepeler sites complicates the identification of elites. Later Neolithic sites often contain differentiated burial practices, with some individuals receiving more elaborate treatment, more grave goods, or more prominent locations than others. Such distinctions have not been clearly documented at Göbekli Tepe or Karahan Tepe, though the limited excavation of burial contexts restricts what can be concluded. The possibility of ritual specialists or religious leaders has been proposed but not demonstrated. The sophisticated iconographic programs at Taş Tepeler sites could have been designed and executed by individuals with specialized knowledge transmitted through formal or informal training. Such specialists might have occupied positions of authority or influence within their communities without necessarily controlling economic resources or labor in ways that would leave clear archaeological traces. Recent scholarship has suggested that the organization required to build the Taş Tepeler monuments may mark the beginnings of class society and patriarchy, with monumental construction serving as a mechanism for establishing and reinforcing social distinctions. The explicit phallic imagery at Karahantepe and Sayburç has been interpreted as evidence for male-dominated ritual systems that may have accompanied or facilitated emerging gender hierarchies. However, such interpretations remain speculative given the limitations of material evidence for reconstructing social relations in prehistory. The deliberate filling and abandonment of Taş Tepeler sites around 8000 BCE coincides with fundamental transformations across the broader Near East. This period, marking the transition from pre-pottery Neolithic B to subsequent phases, saw the establishment of fully agricultural economies, the development of pottery technology, and the emergence of new forms of settlement and social organisation. The reasons for abandonment remain debated. Climate change during the 8.2 kilo-year event, a sharp cooling period documented in paleoclimate records, may have stressed populations dependent on wild resources and early cultivation. The expansion of agricultural communities, with their larger populations and more intensive land use, may have displaced or absorbed hunter-gatherer remnants. Ideological transformation, with new belief systems and social values replacing those embodied in the T-shaped pillar tradition, may have rendered the old monuments obsolete or inappropriate. The filling of the monuments with soil, rubble, and settlement debris protected them from erosion and weathering, but also removed them from active cultural use. Later populations living in the same region apparently retain no memory of what lay buried beneath the hills. When Kurdish nomads encountered the limestone slabs protruding from the ground at Göbekli Tepe, they interpreted them as grave markers from an Islamic cemetery, rather than remnants of a far more ancient tradition. This loss of cultural memory represents a fundamental discontinuity in human experience of the landscape. For 12,000 years, the monuments lay hidden, their builders forgotten, their purposes unknown. The recovery of this lost world through modern archaeology represents not just the discovery of old stones, but the reconnection with ancestors whose achievements had been completely erased from collective memory. The implications of the Taş Tepeler discoveries extend beyond academic archaeology to fundamental questions about human nature and human history. If complex social organisation, sophisticated technical achievement, and elaborate symbolic systems can emerge among hunter-gatherer populations in the absence of agriculture, then the conventional narrative of human progress requires reconsideration. The standard story positions agriculture as the enabling technology that made civilization possible. Without the food surplus generated by farming, the argument runs, there could be no specialists, no monuments, no cities, no writing, no states. The sequence appears inevitable. Agriculture leads to surplus, Surplus leads to complexity. Complexity leads to civilization. The Taş Tepeler evidence suggests a different sequence. Complexity preceded agriculture. Monuments preceded farms. The organizational capacity, technical knowledge, and symbolic sophistication demonstrated at Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites developed within foraging societies that had not yet domesticated plants or animals. Agriculture, when it came, did not create this complexity but inherited it, redirecting existing capabilities toward new subsistence strategies. This reordering has profound implications for understanding human potential. If complexity does not require agriculture, then the capacities that produced it, the ability to organize labor, transmit knowledge, create symbols, and construct monuments, are not products of a particular economic system, but inherent human characteristics that can be expressed under various conditions. The boundaries we draw between primitive and civilized, between pre-agricultural and agricultural, between prehistoric and historic, may reflect our categories more than ancient realities. The Taş Tepeler also demonstrate that progress is not guaranteed. The declining trajectory of architectural achievement, from the massive enclosures of early Göbekli Tepe to the modest structures of later phases, shows that capabilities can be lost as well as gained. The knowledge and organization that produced the earliest monuments were not maintained indefinitely but diminished over generations, for reasons that remain unclear. This pattern of early peak followed by gradual decline contradicts comfortable assumptions about inevitable improvement. The people who lived after the monuments were built were not necessarily better off than those who built them. They may have lost more than they gained in the transformation from foraging to farming, from mobility to settlement, from the old symbolic systems to whatever replaced them. The integration of the Taş Tepeler into broader narratives of human history remains incomplete. The sites challenge existing frameworks without yet providing clear alternatives. How should we understand societies that built monuments before they built farms? How should we categorize communities that combined characteristics previously assumed to belong to different stages of cultural evolution? How should we explain technical sophistication in the absence of the economic structures supposedly required to produce it? These questions will occupy scholars for decades to come. Each excavation season produces new evidence that refines, complicates, or overturns previous conclusions. The 30 artifacts revealed in the 2025 season alone, including the sealed-mouth sculpture from Sayburç, the carved faces from Sefertepe, the human figurine from Göbekli Tepe's structure D, and the double-faced bead from Sefertepe, add new dimensions to an already complex picture. The Taş Tepeler project continues under the coordination of Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, with participation from more than 36 institutions and 20 experts working collaboratively across multiple sites. The research agenda encompasses not only excavation, but archaeometric studies, technological assessments, symbolic artifact analysis, ethno-archaeology, and conservation. The goal is to establish the region as the Neolithic capital of the world, a designation that the evidence increasingly supports. International exhibition programs have brought Taş Tepeler discoveries to global audiences. Following the successful Rome installation, exhibitions are planned for Berlin's James Simon Gallery, London's Guildhall Art Gallery, and the Tokyo National Museum. Findings from the project have been presented at more than 100 conferences worldwide, inserting Taş Tepeler into scholarly conversations across disciplines. The tourism infrastructure surrounding the sites continues to expand. A new visitor centre at Göbekli Tepe provides interpretation and access facilities, while a research centre with excavation housing nears completion at Karahantepe. Since opening to visitors, Göbekli Tepe has welcomed 4 million tourists, including approximately 750,000 in 2025 alone, reflecting growing global awareness of the site's significance. The narrative that emerges from the Taş Tepeler excavations resists simple formulation. These were not primitive people struggling at the margins of survival. They were communities capable of sustained cooperative effort, sophisticated technical achievement, and complex symbolic expression. Their monuments, built at what was supposed to be the dawn of civilization, demonstrate capabilities that would not be matched for millennia. Nor were these people isolated innovators, geniuses who appeared from nowhere and left no successors. They belonged to a regional network of interconnected communities sharing architectural traditions, symbolic systems, and probably kinship connections. Their achievements were not individual but collective, developed across generations and distributed across hundreds of kilometers. The transformation from these early communities to the agricultural societies that followed involved both continuity and change. The same populations or their descendants made the transition. The same landscape, enriched by wild ancestors of domesticated crops, provided the setting. Some traditions persisted. Rectangular buildings, stoneworking, long-distance exchange. Others disappeared, the T-shaped pillars, the circular enclosures, the elaborate animal iconography that had characterized the earlier phase. What drove this transformation remains the central question for Taş Tepeler research. Whether the monuments inspired agriculture, resisted it, or simply preceded it through unrelated processes, the relationship between these two great achievements of early humanity deserves continued investigation. The evidence is accumulating, but interpretation remains provisional, subject to revision as new discoveries emerge from the Turkish hills. The sites themselves continue to speak, though in a language that requires patient translation. The T-shaped pillars, standing in their circles or fallen into the debris of millennia, preserve the intentions of people who lived before cities, before writing, before metal. Their carved reliefs, depicting animals that no longer exist in these hills, and symbols whose meanings have been lost, record a worldview that we can glimpse but never fully recover. The human figures emerging from the stone with their skeletal torsos and explicit sexuality, their sealed mouths and embedded eyes, represent ancestors we never knew we had. Their achievements, buried and forgotten for 12,000 years, have returned to challenge our assumptions about what early humans could accomplish and how they understood their world. The scholarly conversation surrounding these sites will continue for generations. Each interpretation will be contested, refined, or abandoned as evidence accumulates. What cannot be contested is the fundamental revision that the Taş Tepeler require, our understanding of the Neolithic transition, of the origins of complexity, of the relationship between economic systems and cultural achievement must accommodate what these stones reveal. The hills of southeastern Turkey, where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers begin their journey toward Mesopotamia, witnessed the emergence of something unprecedented in human history. Not the first settlements, not the first tools, not the first art, but the first monuments, the first sustained expression of human aspiration in enduring stone. Whatever else may be discovered, this achievement establishes the Taş Tepeler as one of the crucial landscapes in the human story, a place where our ancestors demonstrated capabilities that their descendants would not match for millennia. The excavations continue, the interpretations evolve, the stones remain, testimony to what was possible at the very beginning of the world we have inherited. The specific enclosures documented at Göbekli Tepe merit detailed examination, as their individual characteristics reveal patterns that illuminate broader questions about the site's function and development. Enclosure D, the largest and oldest complete structure excavated to date, measures approximately 30 meters in diameter and generated the oldest radiocarbon date yet obtained from the site, 9530 BCE. The central pillars of Enclosure D, designated Pillar 18 and Pillar 31, stand facing each other across the open central space. Each measures approximately 5.5 meters in height and displays extensive carved decoration. Pillar 18 features a belt carved in relief around its midsection, with hands meeting at the buckle position, reinforcing the anthropomorphic interpretation of the T-shape as representing a stylized human figure. The surfaces of both pillars bear carved animals, with Pillar 31 displaying the famous scene often called the vulture stone. This relief, occupying a prominent position on Pillar 31, depicts multiple vultures in various postures, along with other animals, geometric symbols, and a headless human figure. The scene has generated extensive scholarly debate regarding its meaning. Some researchers interpreted it as depicting excarnation practices, with the vultures representing the carrion birds that consumed exposed corpses as part of funerary ritual. Others see astronomical symbolism, proposing that the arrangement of animals and symbols represents stellar constellations or records a significant celestial event. Dr. Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh has proposed that the vulture stone encodes a lunisolar calendar, with the V-shaped marks carved on the pillar representing individual days in a system tracking solar and lunar cycles. In this interpretation, the imagery commemorates a catastrophic comet strike around 10,850 BCE, which Sweatman links to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the proposal that a cosmic impact triggered the climate downturn that preceded the establishment of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. This astronomical interpretation remains controversial within mainstream archaeology, with critics noting that Sweatman's background is in chemical engineering rather than archaeology, or archaeoastronomy. The connection between pillar imagery and astronomical observation, while intriguing, depends on assumptions about ancient knowledge systems that cannot be verified from material evidence alone. What can be established is that the vulture stone and similar carved reliefs represent substantial investments of skilled labour and demonstrate sophisticated planning. The carving had to be executed before the pillar was erected, requiring sculptors to anticipate the final orientation and viewing angles of their work. The consistency of imagery across multiple pillars suggests coordinated design rather than improvised decoration, implying some form of organising authority or shared conceptual framework that guided artistic production. The animal repertoire depicted at Göbekli Tepe demonstrates remarkable consistency across enclosures and construction phases. Certain species appear repeatedly: foxes, boars, anchors, scorpions, vultures, cranes, lions, aurochs, and various birds. The selection does not simply mirror the species most commonly hunted or encountered, but appears to reflect deliberate choices based on symbolic significance. Foxes occupy a particularly prominent position in Göbekli Tepe iconography. Multiple pillars feature fox reliefs, and a remarkable carved fox appears to be descending toward the joined hands on Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. The emphasis on foxes is notable because the species does not figure prominently in the archaeofaunal record from the site. Whatever significance foxes held for the builders of Göbekli Tepe was primarily symbolic rather than economic. Comparison with later Near Eastern mythology suggests possible interpretations, though such connections span millennia and must be approached cautiously. Foxes appear in Sumerian literature as creatures associated with cunning, liminality, and communication between worlds. Whether such associations extend back to the pre-pottery Neolithic cannot be determined with certainty, but some scholars have suggested that core elements of Near Eastern symbolic systems may have originated in traditions as old as the Taş Tepeler culture. Snakes appear with striking frequency, carved in relief on pillar surfaces, depicted in sculptural form, and represented on portable objects. Based on the snake's association with earth, regeneration, and transformation in documented later traditions, some researchers propose that similar symbolic meanings may have roots in Neolithic symbolism. The shedding of snake skin, the emergence of new life from apparent death, could have provided a powerful metaphor for communities grappling with questions of mortality, continuity, and rebirth, though such interpretations remain speculative. Scorpions, vultures, and lions represent dangerous creatures whose presence in built environments would normally be unwelcome. Their prominent representation at Göbekli Tepe has led some scholars to suggest that symbolic incorporation of dangerous beings may have served protective or empowering functions, potentially transforming threats into guardians or allies through artistic representation. The emphasis on wild, dangerous animals stands in contrast to the domestic animal imagery that would come to dominate later Neolithic iconography. Sites like Çatalhöyük, dating to approximately 7500 to 5700 BCE, feature cattle imagery prominently, with bulls' heads and horns installed on interior walls and paintings depicting human interaction with large bovines. The shift from wild predators to domesticated prey animals in artistic emphasis may track changing relationships between humans and the animal world as domestication transformed both. The portable artifacts recovered from Taş Tepeler sites provide evidence for daily activities that complement the dramatic monumental architecture. Stone vessels, including cups, bowls, and platters, demonstrate skilled craftsmanship in materials distinct from the limestone used for architectural elements. Some vessels were carved from harder stones requiring different working techniques and possibly different raw material sources. Shaft straighteners, tools used in the production of arrow shafts, appear at multiple Taş Tepeler sites, indicating that hunting with bow and arrow remained an important activity throughout the occupation period. The production of effective projectile points from flint, combined with the preparation of wooden shafts, represents a technological chain requiring multiple specialized skills and tools. Grinding equipment, including mortars, pestles, and handstones, provides direct evidence for food processing activities. The surfaces of these tools bear wear patterns consistent with grain processing, though the grains themselves were wild rather than domesticated varieties. The scale of grinding equipment recovered from Göbekli Tepe, numbering in the hundreds of individual pieces, suggests processing on a level that exceeded immediate household needs, supporting interpretations that emphasize communal feasting as a key social institution. The flint tool assemblage from Göbekli Tepe resembles that of other northern Levantine pre-pottery Neolithic sites, including diagnostic projectile point types that serve as chronological markers. Elkium, Helwan, and Aswad points from the PPNA period give way to Byblos and Nemric points during the PPNB, with Nevallochori points appearing more rarely. The absence of late PPNB characteristic forms confirms the site's abandonment around 8000 BCE, before the final phase of the pre-pottery Neolithic period. The stone tool assemblage also includes items that defy easy functional categorization. Carved stone plaques, some bearing geometric designs or possible symbolic markings, may have served as personal objects, ritual implements, or tokens in systems of accounting or communication that remain poorly understood. Similar objects from other Neolithic sites have been interpreted as precursors to late accounting and recording systems, though such interpretations remain speculative. The relationship between the Taş Tepeler tradition and contemporary developments in other regions of the Fertile Crescent illuminates the broader context of Neolithic transformation. Sites in the southern Levant, including Jericho with its famous tower and walls, developed along parallel but distinct trajectories during the same period. The presence of T-shaped pillars and shared iconographic elements at sites across a broad geographical range indicates cultural connections spanning hundreds of kilometres. The site of Nevallochori, now submerged beneath the Ataturk Dam reservoir, provided the first evidence that T-shaped pillar architecture extended beyond Göbekli Tepe, excavated by Harald Hauptmann. Between 1983 and 91, Nevallochori revealed a cult building with T-shaped pillars, terrazzo floors, and carved reliefs that shared obvious affinities with later discoveries at Gobekli Tepe. The radiocarbon dates from Nevallochori placed it in the early PPNB period, around 8400 to 8100 BCE, making it somewhat later than the earliest Göbekli Tepe constructions. The submergence of Nevallochori represents an irreplaceable loss, as the site can no longer be reinvestigated with improved techniques or expanded questions. Fortunately, extensive documentation and artifact recovery preceded the flooding, preserving a record that continues to inform interpretation of the broader Taş Tepeler phenomenon. Other sites in the Taş Tepeler network are only beginning to reveal their potential. Habitation has yielded T-shaped pillars and carved reliefs while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. Çakmaktepe features bedrock-cut dwellings with terrazzo floors and conical pits that recall construction practices documented at Natufian sites in the Levant, suggesting connections to earlier traditions in the region. Ayanlar Hoyuk has produced stone vessels and grinding equipment consistent with patterns documented at other network sites. The distribution of sites with T-shaped pillars and related architectural features maps a cultural zone that scholars increasingly recognize as a distinct phenomenon within the broader Neolithic transformation. This T-pillar culture, or Göbekli Tepe culture, represents a regional tradition that developed, flourished and declined within a specific geographical area and chronological range, leaving behind monuments that would not be matched in scale or ambition for millennia. The role of feasting in Taş Tepeler social organisation has emerged as a central theme in recent interpretations. The evidence for large-scale food processing, the presence of massive brewing vessels, the abundant animal bones with butchering marks, and the apparent gathering capacity of the monumental enclosures all point toward communal consumption events that transcended ordinary domestic meals. Anthropological studies of feast-based societies provide comparative frameworks for understanding this phenomenon. Competitive feasting, documented ethnographically in diverse cultural contexts, involves the accumulation and display of food resources as a means of establishing social prestige, forging alliances, and creating obligations among guests. The hosts of successful feasts gain social capital that can be converted into political influence, marriage opportunities, and claims on future reciprocation. In the Taş Tepeler context, construction of monumental enclosures may have provided both the setting and the occasion for competitive feasting. Based on ethnographic parallels, some researchers suggest that different kin groups or communities could have competed to host the most impressive events, with the monumental architecture serving as permanent testimony to hosting capacity and social ambition. The periodic gathering of dispersed populations at central locations like Göbekli Tepe would have created opportunities for exchange, marriage negotiation, conflict resolution, and the transmission of cultural knowledge, though the specific social mechanisms remain uncertain. The beer brewing hypothesis, first proposed by Klaus Schmidt and subsequently elaborated by other researchers, fits within this competitive feasting framework. Beer production requires substantial quantities of grain, specialized knowledge of fermentation processes, and vessels suitable for the brewing and serving. The presence of large stone troughs at Göbekli Tepe, which some researchers have interpreted as possible brewing, vessels, and the extensive evidence for grain processing provides circumstantial support for this interpretation, though definitive proof of beer production remains elusive. If beer was indeed brewed at these sites, the social effects of alcohol consumption may have enhanced the cohesive and transgressive potential of feasting events. Shared intoxication creates bonds of intimacy and vulnerability among participants, breaking down barriers that might otherwise inhibit cooperation or communication. At the same time, alcohol-fueled gatherings create potential for conflict, which could have required mechanisms of social control that may have been embodied in the ritual frameworks associated with the monumental enclosures. The termination of the Taş Tepeler tradition around 8000 BCE coincided with climatic events that may have stressed populations throughout the Near East. The 8.2 kilo-year event, documented in paleoclimate records from ice cores, ocean sediments, and cave formations, represents a sharp cold episode lasting approximately 2 to 4 centuries. This event disrupted established patterns of precipitation, vegetation, and animal distribution across the region. For communities that had developed during the relatively favourable conditions of the early Holocene, the 8.2 kiloyear event may have created challenges that existing adaptive strategies could not address. Some researchers propose that if the feasting-based social organisation of the Taş Tepeler depended on reliable food surpluses, then climatic deterioration that reduced resource availability would have undermined the economic foundations of the cultural system, though direct causal connections remain difficult to establish. The transition to full agriculture, which accelerated during and after the 8.2 kiloyear event, may represent an adaptive response to climatic stress. Domesticated crops, with their higher yields and greater predictability than wild resources, could have offered solutions to food security challenges that foraging could not match. Based on the available evidence, some scholars suggest that the organisational capabilities developed through centuries of monumental construction and communal feasting may have been redirected toward agricultural intensification once the incentives aligned. This interpretation positions the Taş Tepeler not as a dead end, but as a crucial developmental stage that potentially prepared communities for agricultural transformation. The skills, knowledge, and social forms cultivated through the T-pillar tradition did not disappear, but may have been transformed and reapplied in new contexts. The communities that buried Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE were almost certainly the ancestors of the farmers who would eventually give rise to the civilizations of Mesopotamia and beyond. The significance of the Taş Tepeler discoveries continues to grow as excavation reveals new evidence, and analysis refines understanding. Each season brings unexpected finds that challenge existing interpretations and suggest new research directions. The human statue discovered in Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe in 2025, the sealed-mouth sculpture from Sayburç, the dual-faced bead from Sefertepe, each adds complexity to an already intricate picture. The scholarly community has responded with intense engagement. Publications on Taş Tepeler topics have multiplied exponentially since Klaus Schmidt's initial reports, with contributions from archaeologists, anthropologists, geneticists, climatologists, and specialists in fields ranging from archaeobotany to computational modelling. The site's UNESCO World Heritage status, granted to Göbekli Tepe in 2018, has elevated its visibility and created institutional frameworks for long-term preservation and investigation. Yet much remains uncertain. The specific beliefs and practices of Taş Tepeler communities, the social structures that organise their labour and sustain their traditions, the meanings they attach to their elaborate symbolic systems, all resist definitive reconstruction from material evidence alone. The absence of writing means that interpretation depends on analogy, inference, and comparison with later documented traditions whose relevance cannot be assumed. What can be established with confidence is that the Taş Tepeler represent something unprecedented in the human record: the emergence of monumental architecture, complex symbolism, and sophisticated technical capability among communities that had not yet adopted agriculture. This achievement challenges fundamental assumptions about the necessary conditions for cultural complexity and the sequence of developments that led to civilization as we know it. The stones of Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites preserve testimony to human capabilities that exceed what conventional models predicted. They stand as monuments to ancestors whose achievements were forgotten for 12,000 years, but whose legacy, buried beneath the Turkish hills, has now re-emerged to reshape understanding of human history. Whatever else future excavations may reveal, this fundamental revision of the human story stands as the enduring contribution of the Taş Tepeler to knowledge of our shared past. The methodology employed at Taş Tepeler excavations reflects contemporary best practices in archaeological science, combining traditional field techniques with advanced technological applications. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have mapped subsurface features across extensive areas, identifying buried structures without the disruption of excavation. Geomagnetic surveys have detected anomalies in soil composition that indicate anthropogenic activity, guiding the placement of excavation trenches toward areas of highest research potential. LiDAR scanning has produced detailed three-dimensional models of exposed architecture, creating permanent digital records that preserve spatial relationships even as excavation inevitably destroys the context it investigates. These digital models enable virtual reconstruction, comparative analysis, and public visualization that would be impossible with traditional documentation alone. Photogrammetry techniques have captured the carved surfaces of T-shaped pillars at resolutions that reveal tool marks, traces of pigment, and details invisible to casual observation. Laboratory analysis complements field investigation. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials, including charcoal, bone, and plant remains, provides the chronological framework within which construction and occupation phases can be ordered. Stable isotope analysis of human and animal remains reveals dietary patterns, migration histories, and environmental conditions. Phytolith analysis of soil samples and residues on grinding tools identifies the plant species that ancient communities processed and consumed. The integration of these multiple analytical approaches produces a picture of Taş Tepeler communities that far exceeds what any single method could achieve. The massive T-shaped pillars visible to any visitor represent only the most obvious element of a complex technological and social system that extended from quarry selection and stone working through community organization and symbolic expression to the eventual abandonment and burial that preserved the sites for modern discovery. The educational and touristic potential of the Taş Tepeler sites has attracted substantial investment from Turkish government authorities. The designation of 2018 as the Year of Göbekli Tepe reflected official recognition of the site's significance for national identity and international visibility. The protective shelter constructed over the main excavation area, spanning approximately 4,000 square metres and funded jointly by Turkish authorities and the European Union, preserves exposed structures while allowing visitor access. The visitor experience at Göbekli Tepe now includes interpretive displays, guided pathways, and facilities that accommodate the growing number of tourists drawn by media coverage and scholarly attention. The site has welcomed 4 million visitors since opening to the public, with annual numbers continuing to increase. This tourism generates economic benefits for the surrounding region while creating challenges for site preservation that require ongoing management. The balance between access and preservation represents a persistent tension in cultural heritage management. Foot traffic, atmospheric conditions, and the mere presence of visitors create cumulative impacts on fragile archaeological deposits. The construction of elevated walkways, climate control systems, and visitor capacity limits addresses these concerns while maintaining the public engagement that justifies preservation investments in the first place. The planned research centre at Karahantepe will expand facilities for archaeological investigation while creating infrastructure for extended field seasons. Housing for excavation teams, laboratory spaces for artifact processing, and storage facilities for recovered materials will support intensified research activities in coming years. The integration of research and presentation functions at a single site reflects contemporary approaches to archaeological heritage that emphasize living research programs rather than static monuments. International collaboration has characterized Taş Tepeler research from the beginning, with German, Turkish, and other researchers working together under various institutional arrangements. The current framework, coordinated through Istanbul University in partnership with the Şanlıurfa Museum and supported by Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, brings together more than 36 institutions and over 200 specialists across multiple disciplines. This collaborative model maximizes the expertise brought to bear on complex research questions while distributing the costs and benefits of investigation across participating institutions. The exhibition program that has brought Taş Tepeler artifacts to international audiences represents another dimension of this collaborative approach. The Rome installation at the Pontis Colosseum, featuring replica pillars and interpretive materials, introduced millions of visitors to Neolithic Anatolia who might never have the opportunity to visit Turkey. Planned exhibitions in Berlin, London and Tokyo will extend this reach further, positioning the Taş Tepeler as globally significant heritage rather than purely regional or national property. The knowledge generated through this research and disseminated through exhibitions, publications and media coverage contributes to broader understanding of human history. The story of Göbekli Tepe has entered popular consciousness as an emblem of archaeological surprise, proof that the past can still overturn comfortable assumptions about how and when human achievements emerged. Each new discovery from the Taş Tepeler extends this story, adding detail and complexity to a narrative that continues to unfold. The excavations will continue for decades, perhaps for a century or more, before the full extent of the Taş Tepeler phenomenon is documented. Future scholars, working with methods and questions not yet conceived, will build upon the foundations laid by current research. The stones themselves, patient and enduring, will yield their secrets gradually, resisting easy interpretation while rewarding sustained engagement. What emerges from the Turkish hills is not simply a revised timeline or an updated catalogue of ancient achievements. It is a transformed understanding of human capability, of the conditions under which complexity can emerge, of the paths by which foraging societies became agricultural civilizations. The people who raised the T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe and Karahantepe, who carved their elaborate reliefs and gathered in their circular enclosures, who processed wild grain and hunted gazelle while building monuments to last millennia. These people were our ancestors in more than genetic terms. They were the first to demonstrate what humans could achieve when they committed themselves to collective projects that exceeded individual lifetimes. Their achievement stands, buried and preserved through 12,000 years of forgetting, now recovered for a world that desperately needs to understand where it came from and what it might become. The Taş Tepeler speak across the ages, testimony to possibilities that remain open wherever humans gather to build something greater than themselves.